Over the course of these next few weeks, I'd like to share with you some devotional thoughts from the book of Psalms. This morning, I'm going to consider Psalm 62. The main theme of this psalm is the right and wrong objects of faith. If we trust in God, we're secure. If we trust in men or in things, we're depending on that which is vanity. In verse 9, the word there means a vapor. And so in this psalm, we see David facing a life-threatening situation, yet it contains no prayer, just confidence. One commentator writes, "There is scarcely another psalm that reveals such an absolute and undisturbed peace, in which confidence in God is so completely unshaken, and in which assurance is so strong that not even one single petition is voiced throughout the psalm." Of course, David experienced this peace through prayer, and he exhorts God's people to pour out their hearts before him. He says in verse 8, "Trust in him at all times, ye people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." All of us certainly want to have this same peace and confidence that David has in his own time of crisis. So let's see what David knew to be true about God and that provided such peace and confidence for him. First of all, as we move through this psalm, we see that David realized that God is our salvation, so therefore we should submit to him. In verses 1 through 4, we read, "Truly my soul waiteth upon God, from him cometh my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. How long will you imagine mischief against a man? Ye shall be slain, all of you. As a bowing wall shall ye be, and as a tottering fence. They only consult to cast him down from his excellency. They delight in lies. They bless with their mouth, but they curse inwardly." David shows us here the circumstances that he was experiencing in verses 3 and 4. These verses declare David's need for salvation, or in his case, deliverance. There were fierce enemies that were threatening him. They were counseling together how they might thrust him down from his position as king by assassinating him. They were spreading falsehoods and yet using flattery, telling him that he was a great king while inwardly cursing him. Well, hopefully you'll never have anyone plotting to kill you, but we can certainly all relate to being criticized and slandered. So what does David show us to do in those experiences? Well, he declares his confidence in verses 1 and 2. Verse 1 literally reads, "My soul waits in silence for God only." David here is expressing his submission before God. That word waiteth means submissive silence. So when trouble strikes us, we're faced with a choice. We can angrily complain to God, "I don't deserve such treatment," or we can submit to him, bow to his sovereignty, accept his will without grumbling. David chooses submissive silence before God, and he can do so because of his great confidence in and trust upon God. God was his strength and his stability. So we see that God is our salvation. Submit to him. David also shows us here that God is our expectation. Wait on him. Verses 5 through 8, "My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. In God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, ye people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." In these verses, David really repeats what he had already said in verses 1 and 2 with a few variations. In verses 3 and 4, he's been thinking about his enemies and the extreme threat that they represented. And so perhaps as he thought of them, his confidence might have slipped just a bit. So what does he do? He reminds himself of truth. He repeats in his heart what he had just spoken. You know, we never reach a place of perfect confidence where severe trials simply will not affect us. And so what we must do in order to regain our peace in God is to speak truth to our souls. And that's what David does here. Martin Lloyd-Jones, in his book, Spiritual Depression, Its Causes and Cure, writes this: have you realized that most of your unhappiness in life is due to the fact that you are listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? You must remind yourself of God, who God is, and what God is, and what God has done, and what God has pledged himself to do. And that's exactly what David does in Psalm 62. He piles up description after description of who God is. Don't miss the pronoun my. 9 times David repeats it in verses 5 through 7. If we want his peace in severe trials, we must know God personally and experientially as our God and remind ourselves of who he is. As David waits silently here, he pours out his heart to God. Verse 8 again, what a wonderful verse, particularly in times such as we are in right now. Trust in him at all times, ye people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. David waits silently, yet pours out his heart. That's not being contradictory. Waiting silently in submission is not simply being inactive. It is a time in which we cast all of our cares upon him, yet all the while still remaining in submission. So God is our salvation, submit to him. God is our expectation, wait on him. And then third, David shows us, God is our vindication, trust in him. Verses 9 through 12, surely men of low degree are vanity, and men of high degree are a lie, to be laid in the balance. They are altogether lighter than vanity. Trust not in oppression, and become not vain in robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart upon them. God hath spoken once, twice have I heard this, that power belongeth unto God. Also unto thee, O Lord, belongeth mercy, for thou renderest to every man according to his work. What we notice here is what we are not to trust in. First of all, in verses 9 and 10, David tells us, do not trust in men, in verse 9, whether they be men of low degree or of high degree. They are lighter than vapor, he tells us. They are so insignificant that if weighed, the scales would not even move. So do not trust in men. Do not trust in cruel or dishonest measures. Verse 10. David no doubt has seen many men advance through cruelty and dishonesty. And so he warns against this, especially in light of verse 12, where he says, unto thee, O Lord, belongs mercy. Thou renderest to every man according to his work. And then David says, do not trust in riches. Verse 10 again, he goes on and says, if riches increase, set not your heart upon them. We are quickly learning, aren't we, how quickly things can be taken away from us. And David knew what it was to see riches increase, but he also knew the foolishness of setting our hearts on them. So he shows us what not to trust in, and then he shows us who it is that we are to trust in. And that again is in verses 11 and 12 here. He tells us that we're to trust in the God of power and love, knowing that he will render justice to all. And so David proclaims the power of God to punish sin and his mercy to pardon it. And we too need to remember and to trust in the power of God, to know that he is a God who is always in control, working out and accomplishing his perfect and good will. So let's trust in him. Let's call upon him. Let's know that he is a sovereign God, accomplishing his will in all things.